if a nuclear weapon goes off on United States soil, then that begins to narrow the range of a president's responses. If you can prevent that from happening, actually it opens the door for de-escalation.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What's Really Happening. I'm Dr. Tad Schnoffer, the Strategy and Research Manager here at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. As always, we're joined by GNSI's Executive Director, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie, as we explore global and national security issues. Just recently, President Trump has announced the implementation of the Golden Dome missile defense concept, with its primary purpose of defending the American homeland. Today, we will explore what that concept entails and what possible changes will come with it. Welcome back, General.
Tad, always good to be with you.
So what's really happening with this Golden Dome concept?
Well, Tad, I think Golden Dome is an idea worth exploring. Mm-hmm. I think it's a good, I think the president's onto something here. I think certainly protecting the United States against a nuclear attack is something we should all be interested in seeing brought to fruition. It will be an expensive project. There's a lot of history here, and we can unpack a little bit of that if you'd like. Sure. But my bottom line is I welcome it. I think we should move forward with it.
So let's first start with the history piece. Obviously, during the Cold War, the threat of mutual annihilation between us and the Soviets was a big deal. We obviously had defense measures in place, everything from the missile defense alarm system, MIDAS, not the auto vehicle people, in the 1960s. And then, the Reagan administration implemented what is popularly known as Star Wars, which got to a level of completion. How does this compare to those older systems?
Sure. So, going back into the 50s, 60s, the United States experimented with systems to shoot down incoming ballistic missiles. In the 60s, the Nike system was an Army system, not particularly effective, designed to protect major cities. Then in the 70s, you saw the Sentinel safeguard system, which was one we worked in negotiation with the Soviet Union, designed to protect both missile fields and potentially major urban areas. It used a couple of different types of missiles, a short-range missile and a long-range missile, and it never really fully came online, but we experimented with it in the 70s. The radar from that system, the perimeter acquisition radar, is still up in lovely concrete North Dakota, where it's in use today, actually, to characterize objects in deep space. It's worth taking a look at that actual PAR. You can see it for miles, but it looks deep into space. It's in concrete North Dakota. And actually, when the town of Concrete ceased to exist, as it did, it's now called the Cavalier probably Space Force Station today. But at any rate, there's a residue of that. Now, the Russians also built a ballistic missile defense system, and theirs still exists. Actually, the Galash is the NATO code name for it. A follow-on to Galash actually is centered around Moscow and is designed to protect Moscow from attack. I think we would be able to overcome that if we struck them, which would be a tragedy. But if that occurred, I think that system's probably overcomable. But nonetheless, it's an active ballistic missile defense system in place today. So, of course, when President Reagan came into office in the 80s, we talked about Strategic Defense Initiative. A lot of people oppose that. A lot of scientists oppose it on technical grounds, and a lot of scientists oppose it on theological grounds, which they clothe in technical resistance. So I actually think there was probably some there with that. We never followed up enough to find out. There's a theory says we pressured Russia or pressured the Soviet Union by claiming that we were going to invest in that, which helped push them to ultimate insolvency, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, 1991. I think that's a mixed. There's mixed opinions on that. The history is not real clear to me that actually had a huge hand in bringing the Soviet Union down. But the one thing that we looked at were space-based systems, and I'll come back to space-based systems here in just a few minutes. But the fact of the matter is, if you're going to talk about defending against ballistic missiles, you need to talk about putting systems into space. So today, as you and I talk, Tad, there are not a lot of ballistic missile defense systems out there. Our THAAD, Theater High Altitude Air Defense System, can do exo-atmospheric intercepts above the atmosphere, but it only protects a very narrow footprint. It's not an area defense weapon. And the size of the footprint's classified, doesn't matter for our discussion today. But you're not going to put one in Omaha and defend all of the Midwest of the United States. You might be able to defend a section of Omaha, but it's a very small footprint. The United States Navy has ships, ballistic missile defense shooters, which are Aegis platform ships. Typically your Arleigh Burke late model destroyers and some residual cruiser ships that actually have the capability to do this as well. Again, though, they're very narrow. They're not an area defense system, so can protect you, but not broad areas of protection. The Israelis have some systems that we've cooperated with them on, not Iron Dome. Iron Dome is a much lower altitude system. It's not effective against ballistic missiles. It's effective against drones. It's effective against short-range systems, but would not be effective against an ICBM. What is effective against an ICBM would be David's sling, an arrow, or systems that Israel uses to shoot, again, exo-atmospherically. You're looking at systems outside the atmosphere as they descend in the post-boost phase of their flight. So that's what Israel has used in defending itself against the short-range ballistic missiles that Iran fired against them in the 2 attacks that have been made. And generally, those intercepts have been successful, although they have not achieved 100% results.
Sure.
But finally, one other system that's in place now is we have ground-based interceptors up in Fort Greely, Alaska, that are designed really oriented against the launch of North Korean weapons against the United States. And they would intercept in the post-boost phase after the missile has finished its powered flight. It is beginning its descent to the United States. I think there are 44 ground-based interceptors up there. And the results have been mixed, depends on your point of view. Some people would say not likely to be successful in an intercept. Others have been more positive about that. The problem with these types of systems it's hard to know unless you test it. You got to test it, and it's hard to do those tests.
So what we're looking at with this Golden Dome missile defense concept that President Trump announced recently is it's more about the intercontinental ballistic missiles. It's more the big missiles, the nuclear tipped or something of that nature. We're not talking about smaller drones or anything like that, like you said with the Iron Dome. So with that in mind, what does that actually look like? How would you intercept a missile being launched from North Korea or Russia or China or something like that?
So, Tad, I think what we're going to see in the next few months is we're going to do an intensive study of this, and we're not going to need to uncover new material. We already know the answer to it. Here's the fact of the matter. If you want to shoot at a ballistic missile and intercept it, the time to shoot it is during its powered boost phase. It launches from, say, North Korea.
Sure.
It's going to be in powered boost flight for 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes, depending. During that period of flight, that missile is non-maneuverable. It's on a very fixed trajectory. It has an extremely bright thermal trail. It's easy to see, very predictable. That's the time to shoot it down. If you want to do it, that's when you want to do that. So now, you're not going to be able to do that from Fort Greely, Alaska. You're not going to be able to do that from the United States. In order to do that, you really have to do it from space. Which means you have to have systems in space that will observe the launch, and those systems exist now. We don't need to invent those. But you need something up there that will then engage that missile as it gains speed and begins to exit the atmosphere. The other advantage, when you shoot at it then, the missile can't deploy what we call penetration aids, systems that can be deployed as it enters its post-boost phase that cloud your radar as you look at it, that make it hard to acquire the main target of the warhead itself. Additionally, in descent, a missile may maneuver. It may deploy multiple warheads. It may do a variety of things that make defense much more difficult. None of those things apply in boost. And particularly, that also now we begin to look at hypersonic missiles who now are going to be able to maneuver pretty radically in their late phases. So you want to get to them again early in flight while they're still gaining the speed necessary that will allow them to do those successive maneuvers. So what I come back to, Tad, really is, if we're going to look at this seriously, we need to look at space-based systems. I don't know that there's any other way to do it that offers the promise of technical feasibility.
So with the idea that people might get in their mind of the Golden Dome is like over the United States, this dome of protection. But what you're recommending is that you really have to kind of get out there and touch where the missile takes off or relatively rapidly afterwards. You can't wait for it to come.
I think the evidence is compelling. If you want to gain high, what we call PK, probability kill, you got to get it early in flight. And so therefore, and then you've got to make decisions on, how many are you going to deploy? And that'll be based on the nature of the threat. I mean, defending against a North Korean threat is much simpler than defending against a Russian threat. Defending against a Chinese threat today is much simpler than defending against a Russian threat, although the Chinese threat is certainly growing, and we need to be aware of that. And, of course, the problem is even more complicated than that. For example, ballistic missiles, submarines, can launch. You've now got to be able to take that into account. So if you're looking at North Korea land-based sites, they're fixed. We know pretty much where they will be. And we know the same thing for much of Russia and China as well. But if you're going to defend now against ballistic missiles, you've got to have a little more flexibility in how you position, how you look, and how you position your satellites. All those things, again, are within the realm of technical attainment. It will not be inexpensive to do that. But I would argue, Tad, look, what's the other side of the coin? People argue that what the doctrine of mutual assured destruction has kept us safe for many decades. That's a thin tissue. And I would much rather prefer to have the ability to defend the United States against a nuclear attack rather than depend on the opinions of a national leader in another country who may or may not ultimately prove to be rational.
So what does the threat look like from, let's say, the Russians or the Chinese? Is it primarily going to be these intercontinental missiles that we're trying to defend, or how do we get after that issue?
Today, Tad, the most significant capability that exists against us is, of course, the Russian threat. They can fire many hundreds of ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles against the United States. At the same time, they can launch submarine-launched ballistic missiles against the United States. They pose the most significant existential threat in the nuclear domain that we face today. Additionally, some of their submarines might be able to fire cruise missiles against the United States from much shorter ranges. So it really is a complex threat that we face. Now, it may prove too difficult to be able to defend against that total threat. And I'm not sure that we would need to do that. I think you want to be able to protect against a smaller threat, handfuls of missiles, dozens of missiles, not hundreds of missiles. And that threat would actually be able to accommodate a North Korean threat, an Iranian threat, potentially a Pakistani threat at some point in the future. And probably against China for now, maybe not in the future against China. And would have to, you want to eventually scope and scale your defense to the capabilities of your potential adversaries. So we need to take a look at that. But all those things, I think, are certainly possible things that we would need to be able to defend against.
Right, because you hear people discussing these systems as kind of a bullet hitting a bullet, if you will, a missile hitting a missile. And so they have to be very precise. They have to be locked in. The technology has to be there.
Absolutely, and so much easier to do that in the boost phase.
Right, so do it early. And additional consideration is you have to have enough of these intercept missiles.
You do have to have enough of these intercept missiles. So now you're talking about putting them on orbit. You got to maintain them in space. There's been resistance to militarizing space. I would argue China is already there. The Russians are already there. We need to recognize reality and be able to protect ourselves in the space domain, as others are doing now.
Right. So we'll go to space. With that in mind, what about the Chinese and the Russians, in a sense, particularly the Chinese pushing back on this, is escalating the overall tension between the nations? Now that we can better defend ourselves, they now have to match.
Well, it's laughable, Tad, actually, because the Chinese have heavily militarized space already, and they're busily building a nuclear capability to be at least equivalent to ours by the mid-2030s. So this is typical Chinese propaganda, typical Chinese disinformation, misinformation designed to occlude the argument, if you will.
Sure. So either way, the United States should prepare for defensive actions, even if the Chinese are threatening.
I would argue the president's emphasis is exactly correct.
Right.
It will be expensive. We need to thoroughly look at the technologies, but I would argue the technologies are there to defend against this. We're probably not going to be able to defend against what we used to call a no-notice, over-the-pole, massive Russian attack. But mutual assured destruction is your defense against that. But a smaller attack and even a mid-size attack, you want to be able to defend against. Because then if a nuclear weapon goes off on United States soil, then that begins to narrow the range of a president's responses. If you can prevent that from happening, actually it opens the door for de-escalation.
Right.
So to say that ballistic missile defense is inherently escalatory, I think misses the problem completely.
That's an excellent point, that it gives that buffer for negotiation, because once it goes off.
Once a city is destroyed in the United States, any president is going to have a very narrow range of options to choose from in his response. If you can prevent that from happening, you give the President of the United States more options about how to manage the crisis.
So what role, with that in mind, managing the crisis, the U.S. typically works with allies. What role do allies play? We heard Canada would like to be involved with such a Golden Dome concept. What about other allies, the Canadians? What role do they play?
I think this is something that we should, in the long run, we should work with all our allies to give them the capability to do this. And that's a way forward. I think it's good for the U.S. It's good for them. It would perhaps revitalize some of the alliance structure out there. But I would think, and I don't know this, but I would think that we would certainly work to offer it to our NATO allies as we go forward.
Do you believe that they bring something to the table as well? Obviously, the geography they bring, but do they have other technologies that can assist?
I think, yes, I'm sure they do. I think most of these technologies are going to come from the United States and perhaps some from Israel. But I think we should open it up to as broad a tent as possible as we look at it.
So, and with that in mind, as this program expands, this concept, it's obviously not something that's going to happen in the next year, so it's going to take time to really play this out. So what's the operational timeline for something like this? I mean, a very grand program.
Well, I think you need to move. I think a lot of these technologies exist today. I think we need to move quickly on it. But you're right; it's not a year away. It's much more, much longer than that. But we need to commit to it. We need to lay the scientific research, mine the scientific research that's already out there in order to move forward with it. This is not something that's 20 years down the road. I think it's much closer than that.
And you mentioned cost a few times. So as the DoD cuts costs in some other areas, is this another program that it should invest in and moving forward?
Well, something I think that has to look at. And again, what's wrong about defending the United States against nuclear attack?
Sure, I don't see any issues with it.
I don't see any issues with it either. And I think it's worth the expenditure of money that it would require to do that.
And then looking to our potential adversaries in this type of scenario, what are the defense capabilities of, say, the Russians or the Chinese? Do they have similar, you mentioned it briefly with the Russians, but the Chinese also have defense?
The Chinese have no ballistic missile defense capabilities that I'm aware of. They may have something on orbit that we don't know about.
Sure.
That's always possible with the Chinese. The Russians have the Gulash system that we talked about, which is really designed to protect Moscow, and not much else beyond that. So they will be keenly interested in these systems. As you may recall, President Reagan actually talked about sharing the technology with the Russians, so they would be able to protect themselves too. I don't know that that's the way we want to go with this, but it certainly shows flexibility of thought as you approach it.
And then, as we noted, the Golden Dome concept really focuses on the nuclear missile defense. What about smaller craft? We have drones. We've seen with Israel the different types of missiles that could come in. Should the U.S. also look to maybe have another level of this dome below the missile?
Tad, I think you're exactly right. I think you need to be prepared to operate against long-range cruise missiles. The Russians, we know, are experimenting with those with global range. You want to be able to work against drones, not drones so much, but cruise missiles launched from submarines that are off your shores. That requires really air defense capabilities. It doesn't require new technology so much as additive capabilities that already exist. You're not going to have to invent new things to defend against these capabilities. You are going to have to buy new equipment, buy new radars, buy new missile systems in order to do it. And you're going to have to make some basic philosophical decisions. What are you going to defend? Right. You want to defend your major urban areas, certainly. You also want to be able to defend against your submarine bases, the parts of our nuclear capability that would be necessary to fight if we had to fight, and then our missile fields. So some things, and this has all been thoroughly analyzed and discussed for many decades, going back to the 70s when we first began to look at this. What is it that you want to defend? That will lead you to how much you need and how much you're going to be willing to spend. And look, the last thing I would simply say on this particular subject is hypersonics complicate the problem. They're very difficult to strike once they gain speed, once they gain the ability to maneuver. So that, again, I go back to the point, you want to be able to get them when they launch, not once they're in flight and have had the opportunity to begin their maneuvers.
So we noted exactly getting them early. So we noted that you'd have to pretty much have something in space to be able to respond.
There's really, practically, there's no other way to do it.
What else would be? What other components of this Golden Dome would also need to be in place? Obviously, you need radars, or what else?
Sure. So right now, we actually have in space the best early warning missile system in the world.
Sure.
It's actually in a geosynchronous orbit, about 25,000 miles altitude, that looks down, that gives us infrared notification if someone launches a missile. We know that very quickly. We have other radars that then give us what we call dual phenomenology, which in this business is what you want in order to predict a missile. You want to get two separate sources of its existence and path of movement, so you can then begin to determine where it's going to hit. We can do this in a matter of seconds. It's very quick. I've been part of this process before. So you can do that. Now, for talking about taking weapons in space now, you're probably going to need to put even better radars on low Earth orbit. So once you get the initial indication of a launch, you can lock in on it. Then you're going to have a missile platform, a bus, if you will, with multiple warheads probably, that would then release those and be guided to the target.
Right.
Look, there are a lot of ways to do this that are above our technical level of discussion here. Active, semi-active, passive, all kinds of ways you can apply guidance to a kill vehicle. The key thing, though, is you want to do it when the missile itself cannot maneuver and is on a very, very predictable ballistic path.
Right. And we should note that these kill missiles or interceptors, they're not nuclear. They're just meant to destroy.
Typically, they're not nuclear. They can be high explosive. They can be purely kinetic, where they got to actually hit the vehicle.
Right.
We got people that'll work that out.
Right. But in the end, it is a defensive system.
It is inherently defensive. And I would argue that it actually brings stability. I reject the assertion that ABM systems are destabilizing. And that argument's been made by a lot of smart people. I just don't agree with it. I think anything that adds to your defensive capabilities provides further stability.
Right. And with that stability, as the nuclear problem becomes what's some have called a three-body problem, as the Chinese are rapidly expanding their nuclear program, is this part of a response to that? Is this where that's
grown? I think it could be, Tad. It's where, because look, as the Chinese nuclear arsenal expands, we're either going to have to expand our own nuclear arsenal as we confront two potential adversaries, or you're going to have to come up with a way to protect our own capability. Well, nobody wants to build more nuclear weapons. Right. So here's a path where you don't have to build a lot more nuclear weapons.
And then lastly, to finish up with the overall threats, a number of U.S. treaties with the Russians on nuclear weapons actually will be ending. They're coming to term here in the next few years. And it doesn't look like those will be reinitiated, particularly as the war in Ukraine continues. Is that another area of cause of concern, or is it something that
I tell you what causes concern is the way the Chinese are building nuclear capability. And to negotiate with a single partner in a three-body problem is strategic myopia that we can't afford. So I think I'm not particularly concerned at the idea that these treaties are going to lapse.
Right. Particularly if you have the defenses in place.
Particularly if you recognize you're now dealing with two different entities, the Chinese and the Russians, and you believe you have the capability to at least partially defend yourself against a small to moderate strike.
So with all that in mind, what can we expect of this Golden Dome project in the next couple of years here as we look forward?
Well, I think we're going to see the path forward. They're going to look at all these possibilities. We're going to select which ways we're actually going to deploy. I think that'll come fairly quickly because, again, there's a lot of technology that already exists. We're not going to have to invent a whole bunch of stuff to do this. So I think that'll move fairly quickly. It won't be 6 months. It won't be a year, but it won't be 20 years either.
Right. Yeah, it probably won't stall out as some of those later Cold War programs that ended up not coming to fruition. I think the technology
is better. And again, if you shift to the ascent phase, vice the descent phase, you remarkably simplify your problem.
Well, thank you very much, sir.
My pleasure, Tad, as always.
And that's going to wrap up another episode of What's Really Happening. We held an intriguing discussion with GNSI's Executive Director, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie, about the recent announcement of the Golden Dome missile defense concept. As always, I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer here with the Global and National Security Institute. We thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to our next conversation when we find out what's really happening. Conversation.